Now, is it a coincidence that you have countries like Italy, which was the first major European country to sign on to the Chinese Belt and Road deal? We remember that one. Italy was the first major European country to sign on. Victoria, you will remember, has signed on to China's Belt and Road initiative. These two, coincidentally or not, happen to have the strongest, strictest lockdowns we have seen, similar to the Wuhan lockdown. Is it all a conspiracy? Is it a coincidence? We're going to find out right now from Michael Senger, who is an attorney and researcher based in Atlanta, Georgia, and has written brilliantly on this subject, identifying what China are doing, what they're up to on social media. Michael Senger, welcome to Outsiders.
Thank you, Rowan.
Great to have you here on the show. Now tell us your theories on what has been happening.
So what got me interested in this subject is, starting in March, we essentially had this domino effect where one country after another followed Italy's lead and implemented these lockdowns on China's model. I wanted to find out more about how that happened, what was the science behind that, and what I found was ultimately very concerning. And as I dug further into it, I realized that these lockdowns might not even be science at all. It turns out that they're based on Xi Jinping's philosophy of Hong Kong, which is the same hybrid of health and security policy that actually inspired the re-education of millions of Uighur Muslims in concentration camps. And so this is the exact same policy that inspired his lockdown of Wuhan, and he personally ordered this. There was actually no science behind that. And the WHO explicitly says that lockdowns are completely new to science, completely unprecedented, and have no scientific literature behind them before Xi Jinping ordered them.
James.
So I want to ask about this. Can you walk us through what happened through the beginning of the pandemic? And you talk a lot about how there was a big social media campaign that was run by Chinese Communist Party bots and their sort of invisible armies on Twitter and Facebook. What did they wind up pushing? Who did they target? And how did leaders around the world wind up falling for this, if this is in fact how this all sort of went down?
That's correct. And so China has for many years, really for over 10 years, they have had a massive propaganda army. And it has always been domestically focused. They have hundreds of thousands of human beings who actually sit there day after day and do nothing but make social media propaganda posts on a full-time basis. And they actually generate hundreds of millions of social media posts within China as propaganda. And so what's happened in the last couple of years is China actually took this and expanded it globally. And so now they're generating these social media posts all around the world. And so as one country after another lockdown, I've identified tweets that are state-sponsored. The New York Times actually had an article on this. An Israeli company actually identified a huge ring of tweets, thousands and thousands of tweets using essentially identical language, denigrating all these other governments and essentially encouraging them to adopt China's model. And as more and more countries lock down, this fake activity actually goes from one leader to another, not just national leaders like Boris Johnson, but also governors who resist lockdowns. The fake state-sponsored activity actually follows them and essentially bullies them and insults them for not implementing these lockdowns.
Rita.
But surely that's not going to change policy if you've got thousands or even hundreds of thousands of bots flooding Boris Johnson or the South Dakota governor's Twitter page. Is there really a plot? I mean, what has China got to gain by other countries going into lockdown? I mean, I don't understand what their investment in that is.
No, so that's an excellent question. So there are two different theories here. So it's absolutely beyond question that China had this social media activity going on, had this propaganda going on to encourage other countries to adopt their lockdown model. Now, one question is, were they doing this? Was it simply what George Orwell called doublethink? This was the story within China that the lockdowns were effective in eliminating the virus, so they were going to spread this out to other countries around the world, even though it was a bald-faced lie? Or is there something more sinister behind this? Was this actually planned so that it would crash rival economies and spread authoritarian values like what we are unfortunately seeing take place in Melbourne? We're seeing more and more civil liberties suspended in the hopes that this will eliminate coronavirus. And that is essentially what lockdowns are, is a suspension of civil liberties. It's the idea that if you take all these civil liberties away, that this will get rid of the scary virus.
Michael, you identified some amusing as well as strange activity from these Chinese Twitter users or social media users. One which we'll just play you now. Watch closely. This was supposed. Tell us the story behind this, and then we'll play it. The person who falls over. Just talk us through it. We'll be playing it as you're talking.
So essentially, as soon as Wuhan locked down, as soon as Xi Jinping ordered Wuhan to lock down, these videos started being released all over the world of people spontaneously collapsing in the streets. And look at that, look at that. He actually extends his arms. This video became infamous online because it's so clearly fake. And so people watch this. It's very funny. Like that, the acting is terrible. I hope they don't re-educate people in China for being bad actors.
But people were terrified of
the hands come out. The hands come out, which is a bit of a giveaway for someone who's passed out. So what were they trying to do? What was the thinking behind this, Michael?
And that's what's eerie, is because this was not just advertising their pandemic response. This was not just propaganda saying, hey, look how great China is. This had only one purpose. This and the dozens of other videos like it that went viral all over social media sites that are blocked in China. And they went viral as soon as Wuhan locked down. And the only purpose behind these was to spread fear, to show that this virus was really, really scary, that it was a super virus, that, oh, maybe it came from the lab, but it didn't come from the lab, but we're going to spread that rumor anyway. It's making it sound even more scary. So what was the point of that? Why were they trying to get countries to lock down before they even had any evidence that their lockdown was effective? Why were they trying to sow fear of this virus?
James.
Well, so one of the things that you've written about then with that, well, two things that I think are really interesting here. Number one, tell us about Sweden, which didn't go into lockdown, copped a lot of abuse, but explain why they might have been less susceptible to that. But also I'm really interested in this idea that you talk about, that by getting countries that have a human rights record and believe that they talk about human rights to start acting in authoritarian ways, does that insulate China from criticism from countries about, say, how they treat Uyghurs or other people or control their population, because they say, well, look, we're just doing it to keep people safe, just like in Victoria or Italy or a lot of other places.
That's exactly right. And so at first, back in March, April, I, like most other people, thought that Sweden's decision to not implement a Chinese lockdown was essentially just their own decision. It was just random. It's just what they decided to do. That turns out not to be the case. It turns out that Sweden has a history with China, and they actually have the worst relationship with China of any country in Europe. And just before these lockdowns started happening, Sweden had a major dispute with China over an award given to a publisher who was imprisoned in China, and it was a humanitarian award. And China was threatening all their trade ties. They were threatening things completely unrelated. And it made Sweden really angry that they were not being respected as a sovereign country. And so that kind of makes you think, well, maybe that's the reason they were less inclined to implement this Chinese lockdown policy. And I think that had a lot to do with it. It's just Sweden's historical relationship. They're throwing up their hands. They just can't deal with China anymore.
So, Michael, would it appear, or I don't want to put words into your mouth, but the suggestion would be that China's busy sowing fear throughout the world for various nefarious purposes, and those places with closest links to China, such as Victoria in Australia, Italy and so on, are playing along with this and scrapping civil liberties almost at the request or behest of China. Would you agree with that?
I agree. That's exactly right. There does seem to be a connection between countries and states with closer connections to China and how willing they are to implement this lockdown policy. And that, to me, suggests that China is encouraged them to do that. And also because it's only natural that places that have closer financial ties with China, the leaders are more trusting of China. That's the case with Italy. That's the case with Dan Andrews in Melbourne. And so they're probably more inclined to trust China's response to the pandemic. That is a horrible mistake because the response is snake oil. China never eliminated the virus. No one will ever eliminate the coronavirus through lockdowns. They'll lock down and test and test and test, and the lockdowns will go on literally forever.
Rita, you're there in lockdown city, and may I point out that with a 5% error rate in testing, it is feasible that Victoria, which wants, what was it, get down to 5 deaths or whatever, that's within that error margin, which means you could permanently be in lockdown, Rita. What do you think of that?
Look, I don't think we'll be in permanent lockdown. Look, I'm still dubious about the reasoning behind this. I just don't think it's necessarily those relationships. But I want to ask you also, you mentioned Sweden, and thank God for Sweden, because at least we've got something to compare the lockdown strategy with. Otherwise, that would be all the world would know. But I want to ask you about Taiwan and Japan and South Korea, again, countries that aren't too friendly with China and who never locked down their economies but have had some of the best outcomes for COVID, some of the lowest per capita death rates, and haven't damaged their economy to the extent of other countries. What have you learned through your research on those countries?
Right. And I think some of that is definitely their own pandemic preparedness. They have experience with SARS in the past. And I think some of that is also their inherent distrust of China. They didn't lock down because, frankly, they don't trust the Chinese Communist Party. And a big reason they have had fewer deaths in fewer cases, simply because they tested less. Each of those countries you mentioned conducted less than 15% as many tests per person, and you can look this up, less than 15% as many tests per person as the United States. That's why they're having less cases and less deaths. We're not going to play the Chinese Communist Party's game here.
Michael Senger, fascinating, absolutely fascinating and riveting. Thank you so much. Brilliant study, brilliant research there.
Thank you, Rowan.
And a lot more to come along. Thanks so much for coming on, Michael Senger.